He despised her on their wedding night, but lost control when he saw her with another. Jealousy revealed what he always tried to hide. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because the ending will move you. The Chantilly lace gown was still pristine when Cordelia heard the door of the bridal suite close for the last time that night. The sound reverberated against the burgundy silk-paneled walls like the echo of a silent gunshot, piercing every fiber of her being with cruel precision. She remained motionless before the gilded mirror, contemplating her own reflection. A perfect bride in an empty scene, a porcelain doll dressed in white in a crystal palace that had begun to crack. The scent of gardenias that permeated the air of the luxurious suite at the Plaza Hotel in New York seemed to mock the solitude that enveloped her like a heavy cloak. She had chosen that fragrance so carefully, imagining how he would embrace her and whisper sweet words while the essence surrounded them both. Now the aroma turned bitter, mingling with the metallic taste of tears she refused to shed. Through the window, the lights of Fifth Avenue flickered indifferently to the humiliation burning in her chest like live embers. She could see Central Park in the distance, its trees barely visible in the darkness, while the city pulsed with life and movement as she remained petrified in her prison of silk and lace. Cars passed like shooting stars, carrying lovers, reunited families, people who didn't know the weight of feeling invisible on their own wedding night. Thaddeus had left without a word, leaving only the echo of his footsteps in the marble corridor and the suffocating weight of a marriage beginning in ruins. He hadn't even looked back. Cordelia had watched his retreating figure, the rigidity of his shoulders beneath the impeccably tailored suit, the determination in each step that carried him away from her. The door had closed with a soft click, almost courteous, as if devastation deserved good manners. The ceremony had been perfect in everyone's eyes. 300 guests applauded when the bells of St. Patrick's Cathedral announced the union of two of the most influential families in American agribusiness. The bronze sound had resonated throughout Midtown Manhattan, mixing with birdsong and the excited murmur of spectators who had gathered on the steps to see the bride. Cordelia had walked down the aisle as if floating, the tulle veil falling like a cascade of mist over her shoulders, the train of the dress dragging majestically across the centuries-old stone floor. She, at barely 24, carried on her shoulders not only the 3-meter mantilla that had belonged to her grandmother, but also the weight of generations of expectations. She was the last heir of the Winthrop-Ashford dynasty, an empire built on California wine that stretched from the vineyards of Napa Valley to markets across Europe and Asia. Each step toward the altar was a step toward a destiny others had charted for her, a path paved with obligations and unbreakable traditions. He, Thaddeus Pemberton, at 32, represented the continuity of a coffee empire his grandfather had built in the Pacific Northwest. Pemberton Coffee produced some of the finest specialty coffee in America, exported to the most exclusive cafes around the world. His face had appeared in business magazines, always serious, always impenetrable, with those dark brown eyes that seemed to guard unfathomable secrets. The marriage had been arranged 6 months earlier, when both families' companies needed to merge to survive the economic crisis devastating the American agricultural sector. Cordelia remembered the day her mother had broken the news. They were in the garden of the family estate in Napa Valley, surrounded by century-old grapevines whose twisted trunks seemed to whisper stories of other times. Mrs. Genevieve Winthrop Ashford had taken her daughter's hands in hers, her eyes shining with a mixture of pragmatism and something that might have been apology. "It's best for everyone," she had said, "and who knows, perhaps you'll find happiness." That night, alone in the most luxurious bridal suite in New York, Cordelia slowly removed the mantilla. Her fingers trembled as she undid the pearl pins holding it in place. Her dark hair fell in cascades over her shoulders, releasing itself from the elaborate braids that had taken hours to create. She looked at herself once more in the mirror and saw a stranger, a woman with reddened eyes and lips that had forgotten how to smile. The silence of the room was deafening. She could hear the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece, each second marking the passage of a life that had veered irrevocably from her dreams. She had imagined this night in so many different ways, whispers shared between the sheets, hands finding each other in the darkness. the beginning of a love story they would write together. Instead, there was only silence, abandonment, and the persistent echo of footsteps walking away. Finally, the tears came. They fell silently at first, sliding down her cheeks like crystal rivers, soaking the lace of her neckline. Then came the sobs, deep and wrenching, the kind of crying that was born from the depths of the soul. She let herself fall onto the edge of the bed, the dress spreading around her like the petals of a wilted rose, and wept for everything she had lost before having it, for all the illusions that had died before being born. Outside, New York continued its indifferent course. The bells of some distant church marked midnight, and Cordelia knew a new day had begun, a day that should have been the first of her life as a married woman, as a beloved wife. Instead, it was just the first of many she would face alone, trapped in a marriage that was barely an empty shell, a facade of perfection built on foundations of sand. But something else burned within her, something she didn't yet fully recognize. It was a tiny spark, almost imperceptible among the ashes of her pain, a spark of determination, of pride, of the strength inherited from generations of women who had faced storms and emerged victorious. That night, while the world slept and her husband wandered the streets of a city that didn't belong to them, Cordelia Winthrop Ashford made a silent promise to the woman in the mirror. She would not let herself be destroyed. She would not allow one man's rejection to define her worth. Somehow she would find her own path. Dawn found her still awake, sitting by the window, watching the first rays of sun paint the Manhattan skyline in gold and pink. It was beautiful, she thought, the way light transformed even the darkest corners. Perhaps, just perhaps, something similar could happen to her. The first morning as a wife arrived wrapped in a fog of unreality. Cordelia awakened between Egyptian linen sheets that smelled of solitude and lavender, the pillow beside her untouched, without the slightest sign that anyone else had slept there. For a fleeting instant, she wondered if it had all been a nightmare, if she had really married the day before, or if her mind had played a cruel trick. But the wedding dress hanging in the closet like a white ghost reminded her that everything had been all too real. Breakfast arrived on a polished silver tray, carried by a maid in an impeccable uniform who avoided meeting her eyes. Beside the French porcelain cup and the still warm croissant rested an ivory paper envelope. Cordelia took it with fingers that trembled slightly, recognizing the elegant, precise handwriting she had seen on the prenuptial documents. "I've traveled on business to Seattle. I'll return in a week. The staff has instructions to attend to you." The words pierced like fine needles, each one embedding itself in places she didn't know could hurt. There was no greeting, no farewell, not the slightest show of affection or even basic courtesy. It was a note that could have been addressed to anyone, an employee, a distant acquaintance, no one. And that was exactly what she was to him, no one. She touched the paper, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingertips, and allowed herself to cry for the first time since dawn. Tears fell onto the porcelain cup, mixing with the cooling coffee, forming small ripples on the brown surface. The taste of weeping mixed with the bitterness of the coffee when she finally brought the cup to her lips. 1 week. She had 1 week to decide who she wanted to be. The first days were an exercise in silent survival. She settled into the Pemberton family mansion in Boston's Beacon Hill, a 3-story brownstone built at the turn of the 20th century, with high ceilings decorated with plaster moldings and bay windows that let in the golden light of the Boston sunset. Each room told a story of past generations, portraits of stern ancestors who seemed to judge her from their gilded frames, antique furniture that creaked with every step, a thick silence that clung to the walls like centuries-old dust. Her mother-in-law, Mrs. Millicent Pemberton, was a 70-year-old woman with silver hair pulled into a perfect chignon and eyes that had learned to see without revealing anything. She received her with the icy courtesy reserved for unwanted visitors, showing her the room she would occupy as if doing her a favor. The room assigned to Cordelia was in the East Wing, separated from Thaddeus's by a long corridor and 2 closed doors. "My son is a busy man," Mrs. Millicent explained during that first dinner, breaking bread with fingers adorned with antique rings. "Don't expect him to be available for frivolities." The word frivolities hung in the air, laden with barely disguised contempt. Cordelia understood then that she faced not only her husband's rejection, but also the hostility of a mother-in-law who saw her as an intruder, a stranger who had come to disturb the established order. When Thaddeus returned from Seattle, nothing changed. The first night after his return, Cordelia waited awake until midnight, listening to the sounds of the house, the creaking of wood, the whisper of wind against the windows, the footsteps of servants preparing everything for the night. Finally, she heard the engine of a car, male voices in the entrance hall, and then the unmistakable sound of his footsteps climbing the stairs. They passed directly in front of her door without stopping, without even slowing their pace. The following months established a painful pattern that repeated with the precision of clockwork. Thaddeus arrived late, long after she had retired to her room. During obligatory meals with her in-laws, he addressed her with polite but empty words, as if reciting a memorized script. "Did you sleep well? The weather is changing. Father mentions the harvest will be good this year." Phrases that meant nothing, that barely scratched the surface of any human connection. At social events, the farce was even more elaborate. When they appeared together at the Boston Symphony Orchestra or at charity galas at the Somerset Club, Thaddeus played the role of the attentive husband with almost insulting perfection. He offered his arm, smiled for cameras, inclined his head when she spoke. But his eyes never truly looked at her. They passed through her as if she were transparent, as if he were contemplating something only he could see, something far from that room of chandeliers and candelabras. Cordelia learned to read between the lines of his silences. She perceived the tension in his shoulders when she entered a room, as if her presence were a burden he must bear. She noticed the almost imperceptible sigh that escaped his lips when they had to appear together, the way his fingers tensed when she took his arm. The rejection was never explicit, never cruel words or violent scenes. It was a slow destruction by 1,000 small slights, a constant dripping that eroded her self-esteem stone by stone. One October evening, as rain beat against the windows like impatient fingers, Cordelia descended to the library in search of a book to help her sleep. The house slept, wrapped in shadows and silence, and she walked barefoot through the corridors, enjoying the freedom of not having to maintain appearances. As she approached the half-open library door, she heard voices. "I can't, Mother," Thaddeus was saying, his voice tinged with something that sounded like pain. "I can't pretend something I don't feel." "Then you'll have to learn," Mrs. Millicent responded coldly. "Marriage isn't about feelings, son. It's about duty, about legacy. That girl is now a Pemberton and we expect heirs." Cordelia felt the floor sway beneath her feet. The word heirs hit her like a punch to the stomach. That was what they expected from her. Not love, not companionship, only the biological function of producing the next generation. She retreated silently, her bare feet cold against the marble corridor, and returned to her room with her heart beating so hard she feared waking the entire house. That night, lying in the darkness of her solitary room, she made a decision. If no one was going to value her as a wife, she would find her own worth. She didn't yet know how or when, but the seed of rebellion had been planted, and it was beginning to germinate in the fertile soil of her determination. The Boston autumn arrived with its cutting winds and grey skies, transforming the city into a landscape of dark coats and breaths turned into ephemeral clouds. But for Cordelia, those cold days brought the first ray of hope in months. It was during an obligatory visit to the dressmaker that the idea crystallized. While waiting in the velvet salon of Madame Rousseau's couture house, idly flipping through a magazine, her eyes stopped on an article about businesswomen revolutionizing the world of commerce in America. One of them, a 40-year-old economist, mentioned how she had started her career while trapped in an unhappy marriage, finding in her studies the escape her personal life denied her. The words resonated within her like the tolling of a bell. Study. Why not? She had always wanted to better understand how businesses worked, especially now that she was technically co-owner of one of the largest coffee companies in America. As a single woman, she had been bound to the endless social obligations her mother considered essential for a young lady of good family. But now, ironically, her condition as an ignored wife granted her a freedom she had never had before. That same week, without consulting anyone, she enrolled in a business administration course at Harvard University. Classes took place 3 times a week in a historic building near Harvard Square, where the smell of coffee from nearby cafes mixed with the sound of passionate discussions about market strategies and economic theories. On the first day of class, Cordelia walked through the stone corridors, feeling a mixture of terror and excitement she hadn't experienced in a long time. The walls were covered with portraits of distinguished scholars, and the echo of dozens of students' footsteps created a symphony of life and movement. For the first time in months, she wasn't the abandoned wife of Thaddeus Pemberton. She was simply another student, anonymous and free. Her classmates were mostly young professionals seeking to expand their horizons. Executives from mid-sized companies, heirs to family businesses, entrepreneurs with ambitious dreams. No one knew her story. No one looked at her with the mixture of pity and curiosity she received in Boston's high society circles. Here, she could reinvent herself, build her own identity that didn't depend on her husband's surname or her family's expectations. It was in the 3rd week of classes that she met Professor Barnaby Whitmore. He taught the International Economics course, and from the moment he entered the classroom, Cordelia knew she was in the presence of someone extraordinary. Tall, with prematurely grey hair that gave him a distinguished air, he possessed olive-green eyes that seemed to see beyond words, penetrating directly to the essence of things. His voice was deep and melodious, capable of transforming the driest theories into fascinating narratives. But what truly captivated her was the way he looked at her, not with desire nor with the calculating assessment she had learned to expect from men in her circle. He looked at her with respect, with genuine interest in what she had to say. When she answered questions in class, he nodded thoughtfully, considering her words as if they truly mattered. When she made mistakes, he corrected her gently, guiding her toward the right answer instead of humiliating her before the others. During breaks, they began to coincide at the adjacent cafe. It was a small, cozy place with worn wooden tables and walls covered with old movie posters. The barista, an older man named Samuel who seemed to know everyone, soon learned that she preferred her latte with a pinch of cinnamon, and that Professor Whitmore always ordered black coffee, no sugar. "You have an exceptional analytical mind," Barnaby told her one afternoon, while rain beat against the cafe windows. "Not many students make the connections you make between theory and practice." Cordelia felt a warm flush rise to her cheeks. She had forgotten what it felt like to be praised for something other than her appearance or social position. "I've had good teachers," she responded modestly, "and perhaps too much free time for reading." He smiled, revealing small wrinkles around his eyes that gave him a kind aspect. "Free time well spent is the best teacher. Tell me, what brought you to these studies? You're not the typical profile of our students." The question caught her off guard. She could have lied, invented a convenient story about passion for business or professional ambitions, but something in Barnaby's sincere gaze impelled her to be honest. "I needed to find something that was mine alone," she confessed, turning the cup between her hands. "Something that would remind me who I am, beyond other circumstances." He nodded slowly, without pressing her for details. Sometimes the most difficult moments of our lives are what push us to discover our true strength. "You have potential, Mrs. Cordelia," she interrupted. "Just Cordelia, please." "Cordelia," he repeated, and the way he pronounced her name with respect and warmth was like balm for her wounded soul. "You have potential to achieve extraordinary things. Don't waste it." Those words became an anchor for the difficult days. When she returned to the silent mansion, when she faced tense dinners with her mother-in-law or solitary nights in her room, she remembered that there existed a place where she was valued, where her ideas mattered, where she could grow and transform. Little by little, a genuine friendship blossomed between her and the professor. She discovered that Barnaby was a man of deep convictions who had dedicated his life to education because he firmly believed in its transformative power. He told her about his childhood in a small town in rural Vermont, about how he had been the first member of his family to attend university, about the sacrifices he had made to get where he was. In return, she spoke of her love for literature, of the vineyards of her native Napa Valley, of dreams she had stored in dusty drawers for too long. She never spoke of Thaddeus. That name seemed to belong to another life, to another Cordelia she had left behind when crossing the university doors. And in a way, it was true. Each passing day, the woman who had been abandoned on her wedding night faded a little more, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, more complete. Spring arrived with its explosion of colors and aromas, and with it, an invitation that would change everything. Barnaby proposed she join a study group that met on Saturdays at the Boston Public Library. "They're extraordinary people," he explained as they walked across campus, dodging puddles left by April rains. "Entrepreneurs, academics, thinkers. We discuss ideas, share knowledge. I think you'd fit in perfectly." Cordelia accepted without hesitation. The weekends, until then, empty, while Thaddeus spent time on golf courses in Wellesley with business partners, filled with life and purpose. The group met in a reserved room at the Boston Public Library, where the smell of old books and reverent silence created an atmosphere of absolute concentration. Among century-old oak shelves and windows, filtering the golden light of the Boston sunset, she discovered a version of herself she had forgotten existed, intellectual, curious, capable of contributing to conversations that went far beyond social gossip and the banalities of charity galas. What she didn't know was that each step toward her own light was being observed. That from the shadows of a marriage both had given up for dead, something was beginning to awaken in the man who had ignored her for so many months, something neither of them was prepared to face. The Museum of Fine Arts gleamed that May evening, like a jewel set in Boston's cultural heart. Bohemian crystal chandeliers poured cascades of golden light over the guests, while waiters circulated with silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and exquisite canapes. The annual charity gala brought together the cream of Boston society, aristocrats, business people, artists and politicians, all dressed in their finest, all playing their parts in the perpetual theater of appearances. Cordelia arrived alone, as had become customary. The emerald green gown she had chosen fit her figure elegantly, the color enhancing the brightness of her dark eyes and the olive tone of her skin. Her hair, gathered in a low chignon that let some rebellious strands escape, framed a face that had subtly changed in recent months. There was a new serenity in her features, a confidence that hadn't existed before, as if she had finally reconciled with herself. Upon entering the main gallery, several heads turned to observe her. Barely disguised murmurs followed her as she walked among groups of guests. "That's Thaddeus Pemberton's wife, always alone. They say he has a mistress in San Francisco." The rumors had circulated for months, fueled by the evident distance between the spouses and the feverish imagination of high society. Cordelia had learned to ignore them, to walk with her head held high while poisonous words slid off her like water off stone. That's when she saw him. Barnaby stood near the grand marble staircase, conversing animatedly with a group of academics. He wore a dark grey suit that contrasted elegantly with his silver hair, and his eyes shone with that spark of enthusiasm she had learned to recognize when he discussed topics that passionate him. Seeing her, his face lit up with a genuine smile. "Cordelia," he exclaimed, stepping away from the group to meet her. "I didn't know you'd be attending tonight." "Family obligations," she responded with an ironic smile. "The Pembertons are event sponsors." "Well, I'm glad duty brought you here. Come, there are people I want you to meet." He took her elbow with the naturalness of true friendship, guiding her toward the group he had just left. Cordelia found herself immersed in a fascinating conversation about the economic implications of international trade agreements, completely forgetting the ostentatious setting surrounding her. She laughed at witty comments, contributed her own observations, felt completely in her element. What she didn't know was that from the other end of the gallery, a pair of dark brown eyes watched her with an intensity she would have recognized immediately had she seen it. Thaddeus had arrived late, delayed by a business meeting that had run longer than expected. He crossed the entrance hall with quick steps, instinctively seeking the partners he needed to meet. But upon entering the main gallery, his gaze was captured by a vision that stopped him dead. It was Cordelia, but not the Cordelia he knew. The woman laughing openly beside that gray-haired man radiated a light he had never seen in her. Her face, habitually contained in a mask of polite reserve, shone with genuine joy. Her hands gestured enthusiastically as she spoke, and her entire body seemed to naturally lean toward her interlocutor, like a flower toward the sun. Something contracted in Thaddeus's chest, an uncomfortable, almost painful sensation that took a moment to recognize. Jealousy. For the first time in his life, he experienced true, visceral jealousy, the kind of primitive emotion he had always believed himself above feeling. And what was most disconcerting was that he was jealous of his own wife, of the woman he had ignored for months, whom he had treated as little more than furniture in his own home. He observed how the man inclined his head toward her, to better hear something she was saying, how his hand lightly brushed her elbow, how they both laughed at some private joke. Each gesture, each shared smile, was like a pin embedding itself in places Thaddeus didn't know existed. Who was that man? What right did he have to make his wife shine that way when he hadn't even been able to coax a smile from her? Without quite knowing what drove him, he began walking toward them. His footsteps resonated on the polished floor with a determination that surprised even him. The conversations around him blurred into white noise. Only that image of his wife glowing beside a stranger existed. Cordelia felt his presence before seeing him. A shiver ran down her spine, that inexplicable sensation of being watched with an intensity that altered the very air. She turned slowly, and her eyes met Thaddeus's across the crowded gallery. He was barely meters away, and his expression was something she had never seen, a mixture of contained fury, confusion, and something more. Something wild that gleamed in the depths of those brown eyes that had always been so indifferent. He looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time, as if he had suddenly realized he had been blind all this time. The moment seemed suspended in time. The bustle of the party, the laughter, the music of the string quartet, everything faded until only the two of them remained, trapped in a bubble of electrifying tension. Finally, Thaddeus reached where they stood. He greeted Barnaby with calculated coldness, his jaw tense as if chewing words he refused to pronounce. His hand found Cordelia's waist with pressure bordering on painful, fingers sinking into the silk of the dress as if wanting to meld with her skin. "My wife," he said, emphasizing each syllable with a possessiveness he had never before demonstrated. "Allow me to introduce myself, Thaddeus Pemberton." The way he pronounced those words, as if claiming territory, sent a torrent of contradictory emotions through Cordelia. Rage at the audacity of marking ownership over something he had abandoned, dark satisfaction at finally provoking a reaction in him, disbelief at the sudden transformation of the distant ghost into such an intensely physical presence. Barnaby, apparently oblivious to the undercurrents flowing between the spouses, shook Thaddeus's hand with professional courtesy. "Professor Barnaby Whitmore," he introduced himself. "Your wife is one of my best students. You're very fortunate to be married to such a brilliant woman." The words, though innocent, seemed to add fuel to the fire burning in Thaddeus's eyes. Cordelia felt how the fingers at her waist tensed even more, how the heat of his body beside her was almost suffocating. "Yes," Thaddeus responded with a hoarse voice. "Very fortunate indeed." The rest of the evening passed in a fog of barely contained tension. Thaddeus didn't leave her side for an instant, participating in conversations with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, his hand always in contact with some part of her, her back, her shoulder, her wrist. It was as if he feared that if he released her, she would disappear with that kind-eyed professor. When they finally left the museum, the Boston night received them with its fresh air laden with blooming magnolias. The driver waited beside the black Mercedes, but Thaddeus dismissed him with a gesture. "We'll walk," he announced, surprising Cordelia. They walked in silence through the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill, her heels resonating against the stone like an irregular metronome. The antique street lamps projected elongated shadows on the brick buildings, creating a landscape of chiaroscuro that seemed to reflect the inner turbulence of both. Finally, in a small deserted square in front of a sleeping church, Thaddeus stopped. He turned to her with a tortured expression, his eyes gleaming under the yellowish light. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice rough as sandpaper. Cordelia looked at him steadily, feeling a mixture of power and vulnerability that threw her off balance. "My professor," she responded calmly, "and my friend." The word friend seemed to detonate something inside him. He took a step toward her, then another, until barely inches separated them. She could feel the heat of his body, the vetiver perfume that had always permeated the house but had never been so close. His breathing was agitated, as if he had run miles instead of walking. "Friend?" He repeated the word as if it were poison. "Since when does my wife have friends who look at her the way he was looking at you?" Cordelia felt rage bubble within her, hot and liberating. "Your wife has the right to whatever life she wants, considering her husband has ignored her since their wedding day." The words came out like projectiles, each one finding its target with deadly precision. She saw him recoil slightly, as if she had physically struck him. He began, but she wasn't finished. "You left me alone on our wedding night. You've treated me like a stranger for months. You don't look at me, don't speak to me, barely acknowledge my existence. And now, because another man values me, you decide I'm worthy of your attention." Her voice trembled, but not from weakness. It was the tremor of a storm contained too long, finally releasing itself. "Cordelia." Her name on his lips sounded different, laden with something that dangerously resembled pain. "No," she interrupted, raising her hand. "You have no right. You have no right to be jealous of something you never wanted." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant murmur of traffic and the accelerated beating of their own hearts. Thaddeus looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if every word she had spoken had torn a blindfold from his eyes. And then, for the first time since she'd known him, she saw tears in his eyes. "You're right," he whispered, "about everything. I was wrong. Completely wrong." The confession left her speechless. She had imagined this moment so many times, him finally acknowledging the damage he had caused, asking for forgiveness. But now that he stood before her, his defenses crumbling like walls of sand, she didn't know how to react. "Why?" was all she could ask. "Why did you punish me like that?" Thaddeus closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength to face something he had kept buried for a long time. "Because I was afraid," he confessed. "Afraid to feel again. Afraid to lose someone again." His words floated in the night air, laden with meanings she didn't yet fully understand. But she wasn't ready to hear more. The pain accumulated over months couldn't be erased with a nighttime confession, however sincere. "I need time," she said finally, "and space." She saw him nod slowly, defeat visible in the slump of his shoulders. "Whatever you need," he responded. "But I want you to know, I'm going to fight for you, for us, if there's still anything to save." Cordelia didn't respond. She simply began walking toward the main avenue, where she could find a taxi to take her back to the mansion. But as she walked away, she felt something strange in her chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not even hope. It was curiosity. For the first time, she wondered if the man she had despised for so long was actually a stranger, with a story she had never bothered to discover. The Boston night observed them in silence, keeping its secrets as it always had, a mute witness to a marriage that was finally beginning to awaken from its lethargy. The days following the gala were strange, charged with a new tension that vibrated in the mansion's air like an overtaut guitar string. Cordelia continued with her routine of classes and study groups, but now there was a fundamental difference. Thaddeus had stopped being invisible. He appeared in the most unexpected places. The first Tuesday after that night, when she left the university after her afternoon classes, she found him waiting by the main entrance. He had a bouquet of red carnations in his hands, the traditional flowers she had mentioned loving in some forgotten conversation with her mother-in-law. He was visibly uncomfortable, the confident businessman transformed into something vulnerable that didn't know how to behave. "They're for you," he said awkwardly, extending the flowers. Cordelia looked at them without taking them. "I don't need flowers, Thaddeus." "I know," he responded, lowering his gaze, "but I don't know what else to do. I've never cared about someone enough to learn how to show it." The words, spoken with brutal honesty, caught her off guard. She had expected elaborate excuses, rational justifications. Not this naked confession of emotional incompetence. "You can start by leaving," she said finally. This can't be fixed with flowers. He nodded, leaving the bouquet on the nearest stone bench before walking away. But the next day he was there again, this time with a book, a first edition of The Great Gatsby she had mentioned, searching for months ago, when she still believed someone in that house listened to her. "You remembered," she murmured, unable to hide her surprise. "I remember everything you say," he responded, even if it didn't seem like it. She didn't accept the book either, but something inside her softened imperceptibly, like ice beginning to melt under the first spring sun. The following weeks brought more of the same. Thaddeus didn't pressure, didn't demand, didn't try to force a reconciliation she clearly wasn't ready to offer. He was simply present. He appeared at academic events, sitting in the last row to watch her present papers with the eloquence he never knew she possessed. He sent daily notes, not the cold formal missives from the beginning of their marriage, but handwritten messages that revealed thoughts, fears, hopes. "I passed through the public garden today and saw a couple feeding the ducks. I thought of you. I thought of all the simple things we never did. My father spoke of you with admiration today. He says you're the first Pemberton with real business acumen. I felt proud that you're my wife, though I have no right to feel it. I can't sleep. I wonder if you'll ever be able to forgive me, though I know I don't deserve it." Cordelia kept the notes in a drawer in her desk, reading them sometimes in the solitude of her room. She didn't respond to them, but she read them, and each one left a tiny mark on the armor she had built around her heart. One November afternoon, while studying at the university cafe, she received an unexpected visit. Barnaby arrived accompanied by an elegant woman with chestnut hair and a warm smile. "Cordelia, I want you to meet my wife, Constance," he said with evident pride. "I've talked so much about you that she insisted on meeting you." The revelation that Barnaby was married shouldn't have surprised her, but somehow it did. Not because she harbored romantic feelings for him, but because she realized how much she had projected onto that friendship, the need to feel valued, to be seen, that Thaddeus had never satisfied. Constance proved to be a charming woman, a high school English teacher, with sharp wit and infectious laughter. The three found themselves talking for hours, discovering shared tastes and developing the foundations of what promised to be a lasting friendship. When they finally said goodbye, Cordelia walked home feeling something that took her a moment to identify: relief. The fact that Barnaby had a complete and happy life outside the university meant their friendship was exactly that, a genuine connection based on mutual respect, not complicated by hidden expectations or mistaken interpretations. What she didn't know was that Thaddeus had observed the entire encounter from a coffee shop across the street. He had seen the woman arrive, the way she greeted Barnaby with a kiss on the lips, the naturalness with which she sat beside him. And for the first time, something of the knot that had tightened his chest for weeks began to loosen. That night, during family dinner, something changed in the dynamic between them. Mrs. Millicent had organized a meeting with business partners, which meant maintaining appearances more than ever. But when Thaddeus offered his arm to Cordelia to enter the dining room, she accepted without the usual rigidity. And when he leaned to whisper something in her ear about the absurdity of Mr. Henderson's toupee, she had to suppress a smile. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible advance, but for both of them, it meant the world. The real turning point came a week later, when Cordelia received a call from San Francisco that would change everything. The phone rang at 7 in the morning, a shrill sound that tore Cordelia from sleep. On the other end of the line, her mother's voice trembled with a mixture of fear and controlled fury. "There are problems," Genevieve said without preamble. "Big problems. I need you to come to San Francisco immediately." The following hours were a whirlwind of confusion and growing horror. The family company, the wine empire 3 generations had built, was being investigated for alleged financial irregularities. A disgruntled former employee had presented falsified documents to the authorities, accusing the family of tax evasion and money laundering. The accusations were false, but the damage to their reputation was already done. Banks withdrawing lines of credit, clients cancelling contracts, a stain of suspicion threatening to destroy everything. Cordelia traveled that same afternoon, her heart pounding as the plane devoured the miles between Boston and San Francisco. She hadn't had time to notify anyone at the mansion, had barely thrown some things in a suitcase before running to Logan Airport. Her mind was chaos of worries, for her mother, for the company, for the family legacy that could crumble like a house of cards. The following days were hell. Meetings with lawyers, interrogations with investigators, and endless sessions reviewing documents proving the family's innocence. Cordelia discovered reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, working 20-hour days, organizing the legal defense, contacting forensic accountants who could debunk the accusations. One night, exhausted after a particularly brutal day, she returned to the hotel where she was staying to find Thaddeus waiting in the lobby. He had removed his tie, his hair was disheveled, and he had the expression of someone who had traveled without rest. "What are you doing here?" she asked, too tired to feign indifference. "I came to help," he responded simply. "I brought my lawyers. They're the best in corporate law in the country. I don't need your help." "I know, but you have it anyway." Something in the way he said it, without arrogance or condescension, simply stating a fact, completely disarmed her. She felt the tears she had contained for days begin to well up, and before she could stop them, she was sobbing in the middle of the luxurious hotel lobby, all the pressure of recent weeks finally releasing. Thaddeus held her while she cried. He said nothing, didn't try to console her with empty words, simply wrapped her in his arms and let the storm pass. It was the first time they had touched that way, with real intimacy, without the cameras of social events or the expectations of observers. When the tears finally exhausted themselves, he gently guided her to the lobby sofas, ignoring the curious glances of hotel staff. "Tell me everything," he requested, "from the beginning." And she did. She told him about the accusations, about the former employee's betrayal seeking revenge for a justified dismissal, about the fear she felt of seeing everything her family had built destroyed. He listened, without interrupting, nodding at appropriate moments, his eyes never leaving hers. "We're going to fix this," he said when she finished. "Together." And they did. Over the following 3 weeks, they worked side by side in a way they never had. Thaddeus mobilized his resources, contacted private investigators who uncovered the former employee's true motivation, coordinated with the best forensic accountants in America to demonstrate the falsity of the documents. He asked for nothing in return, didn't use his help as bargaining currency. He was simply there, tireless, dedicated. The nights in San Francisco became something unexpected. After long workdays, they dined together in small restaurants in North Beach, talking about everything except the case, books they had read, places they wanted to visit, dreams they had buried. Cordelia discovered that Thaddeus had a subtle sense of humor he rarely showed, that he was passionate about astronomy and could name constellations for hours, that as a child he had wanted to be a painter before family expectations steered him toward business. "Why didn't you ever tell me these things?" she asked one night as they shared a bottle of wine on the hotel terrace, the lights of the city twinkling at their feet. Thaddeus turned the glass between his fingers, contemplating the ruby liquid as if it contained answers. "Because I was afraid for you to know me," he admitted. "If I showed you who I really am and then you left, I wouldn't have been able to bear it. So you chose to push me away first. It was easier, or so I thought." The confession hung between them, laden with meaning. Cordelia was beginning to understand that the man who had rejected her wasn't a cold monster, but someone deeply wounded who had built walls to protect himself. It didn't excuse him, but it explained him. When the case was finally resolved, all accusations dismissed and the former employee facing charges for document forgery, Cordelia found herself at a crossroads. The months of tension had forged something between her and Thaddeus, something she couldn't ignore. But the pain of the past hadn't disappeared. It had simply been temporarily eclipsed by crisis. On the train back to Boston, seated beside each other in a private compartment, he took her hand for the first time voluntarily. "Thank you," she said, the words scraping her throat, "for everything. Don't thank me, it was the right thing to do. But you didn't have to. After how I've treated you these months." "I treated you worse for a year," he interrupted. "This doesn't begin to make up for it." She didn't withdraw her hand. It was a small gesture, but significant, the first real crack in the wall she had erected between them. Boston received them with its usual bustle, but everything had changed. Upon arriving at the mansion, Mrs. Millicent awaited them in the entrance hall with an expression Cordelia had never seen on her: genuine respect. "What you did for your family," the elderly woman said, addressing her for the first time as an equal, "showed true courage. I'm proud to have you as a daughter-in-law." It was the first gesture of acceptance she had received from that woman, and it meant more than she could express. That night, for the first time in nearly a year of marriage, the three dined in an atmosphere close to harmony, and when Thaddeus accompanied her to her bedroom door, he paused a moment as if struggling with himself. "Good night, Cordelia," he said finally, his voice laden with unspoken things. "Good night, Thaddeus." And as she closed the door, she realized something fundamental had changed. The man on the other side was no longer a stranger. He was someone who had demonstrated, through actions not words, that he was willing to fight for what he had almost destroyed. The question now was whether she was ready to let him in. The Boston summer descended upon the city with its relentless heat, transforming streets into rivers of scorching air and parks into coveted shade refuges. But inside the Beacon Hill mansion, another kind of heat was beginning to gestate, one that had nothing to do with the thermometer. The weeks following the return from San Francisco brought a subtle but undeniable transformation in the relationship between Cordelia and Thaddeus. They were no longer strangers sharing a roof. They were two people cautiously beginning to know each other, discovering hidden layers beneath years of masks and silences. Breakfasts, once solitary, became shared rituals. Thaddeus came down early to find her already seated in the interior garden, reading the newspaper, while the aroma of coffee floated in the fresh morning air. He sat across from her, without forcing conversation, simply existing in the same space. Sometimes they commented on the news, others they remained in comfortable silence, the kind of silence only possible between people who had stopped fearing closeness. One July afternoon, he invited her to visit the vineyards in Napa Valley. "It's green harvest season," he explained, with an enthusiasm she had rarely seen in him. "They prune the green grapes so the remaining ones grow stronger. There's something almost poetic about it." Cordelia accepted, more out of curiosity than anything else. The drive took 6 hours, traversing landscapes that gradually changed from congested highways to rolling hills covered with vines. Thaddeus drove with the window down, the wind tousling his dark hair, singing softly along to radio songs. It was a version of him she had never known. Relaxed, almost youthful, free from the weight of expectations that crushed him in Boston. The Winthrop Ashford vineyards were spectacular. Endless rows of vines stretched to the horizon, their green leaves shining under the afternoon sun. Thaddeus walked with her among the plants, explaining every detail of the cultivation process with the passion of someone who truly loves what they do. "My grandfather brought me here when I was a child," he recounted, caressing the leaves of a vine with reverence. "He taught me that the best things in life require patience, that you can't rush what deserves time." Cordelia observed him as he spoke, noting how his face softened, how the tension lines that normally marked his forehead disappeared. This was the real Thaddeus, she thought. Not the relentless businessman, nor the distant husband, but a man who found peace among the vines of his childhood. That night, they dined at a small family winery that had survived generations. The owner, an elderly woman with wrinkled hands and bright eyes, treated them like old friends, serving homemade dishes that tasted of history and tradition. Wine flowed generously, and with it, confessions. "There was someone before," Thaddeus said finally, looking at the flames crackling in the fireplace despite the summer heat. "A woman. Years ago." Cordelia remained silent, sensing she was finally about to learn the root of the pain that had turned him into the man who abandoned her on their wedding night. "Her name was Sophia. We met at university, in London. I was 23, and convinced I'd spend the rest of my life with her." His voice had become hoarse, laden with memories that clearly still hurt. "We were together 3 years. We planned to marry, have children, build a life away from our family's expectations. I was willing to give up everything for her. What happened?" Cordelia asked softly. Thaddeus took a long drink of wine before continuing. One day she simply disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye. I returned to our apartment and everything of hers was gone. She left a 3-line note saying she'd met someone else and was going to Australia with him. The silence that followed was charged with shared pain. Cordelia could see the scars of that betrayal in every line of Thaddeus's face, in the way his hands gripped the glass like an anchor. After that, he continued, I decided I would never again allow anyone to have that power over me. If I didn't love, I couldn't be destroyed. When our families arranged the marriage, it seemed the perfect solution, a union of convenience, without emotional risks. But you punished me for what she did, Cordelia said without accusation, simply stating a fact. Yes, and when I realized how unfair it was, I had already built walls so high I didn't know how to tear them down. They looked at each other across the table, two broken people who had found different but complementary ways to deal with their pain. Cordelia understood now what had driven his behavior, though understanding didn't erase the damage caused. I'm not Sophia, she said finally. I never have been. I know, he responded, his eyes shining with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. And every day that passes, I regret more how long it took me to see it. That night back in Boston, something had definitively changed. It wasn't love yet, nor complete forgiveness, but it was a beginning, a foundation upon which perhaps they could build something real. For the first time, Cordelia could imagine a future in which her marriage wasn't a prison, but a conscious choice of two people who had decided to try together. When they arrived at the mansion, Thaddeus accompanied her to her room as always. But this time, before saying goodbye, he took her hand and brought it to his lips, brushing her knuckles with a kiss as light as a butterfly's wing. Thank you for listening to me, he murmured, for giving me a chance to explain. Cordelia felt a shiver run through her, something that had nothing to do with cold. Good night, Thaddeus. Good night, Cordelia. And as the door closed between them, she knew the next chapter of their story was about to begin, one they would write together, with all the imperfections and possibilities that implied. Autumn arrived in Boston, wrapped in golds and coppers, transforming the common into a sea of fallen leaves and the air into a fresh caress announcing changes. But with the beauty of the changing season also came ghosts neither of them had anticipated. Cordelia was in the mansion library one October afternoon, preparing an assignment for her classes, when the maid announced an unexpected visitor. Before she could ask who it was, a woman entered the room with the confidence of someone who knows they own any space they step into. She was extraordinarily beautiful, with blonde hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders and ice-blue eyes that seemed to see through people. She dressed with European elegance, an ensemble that screamed Paris or Milan, and carried a travel bag, suggesting she wasn't just passing through. You must be the wife one, she said, with an accent mixing English with something indefinably foreign. I'm Sophia. I've come back to speak with Thaddeus. The name hit Cordelia like a punch to the stomach. Sophia, the woman who had shattered her husband years ago, who had turned him into the man incapable of love she had met on their wedding night. She was here, in her house, with a suitcase as if planning to stay. What do you want? She asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Sophia smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I want what's mine. Thaddeus and I had something special, something no arranged marriage can replace. I made a mistake leaving, and I've come to correct it. Thaddeus and I are married, Cordelia said, standing. You're not welcome here. Married? Sophia laughed, a sound like breaking glass. A contract signed by your families. Is that what you call marriage? I gave him real love, you're just convenient. The words found their target with deadly precision. Everything Cordelia had feared, all the insecurities she had fought to overcome, resurfaced with devastating force. Because Sophia was right, at least in part. Their marriage had begun as a business transaction. Everything she had built since then. Was it enough to compete with a real love from the past? Thaddeus arrived that night to find a mansion in tension. His mother intercepted him in the entrance hall, her face stony. That woman is here, she hissed. The one who destroyed you years ago. She arrived this afternoon and refuses to leave. What followed was one of the most painful nights Cordelia had experienced. From her room, she could hear raised voices, though she couldn't distinguish the words. She paced back and forth like a caged lioness, alternating between rage and terror. What if Thaddeus still loved her? What if all the progress of recent months had been just an illusion, an attempt to fill a void only Sophia could occupy? Finally, past midnight, she heard footsteps in the corridor. A soft knock on her door made her hold her breath. "May I come in?" Thaddeus's voice sounded exhausted. She opened to find him leaning against the doorframe, eyes reddened and hair disheveled. He seemed to have aged years in a few hours. "She's gone," he said without preamble. "For good this time." Cordelia didn't respond, simply stepped aside to let him pass. He entered with heavy steps, letting himself fall into the armchair by the window. "She asked me to choose her," he continued, looking toward the night. "Said she still loved me, that her life in Australia had been a mistake, that we could start over." "And what did you tell her?" Thaddeus turned his head to look directly at her. "I told her she was years too late, that the man who loved her no longer exists, that now there's someone else who occupies every thought, every hope I have for the future." Cordelia's heart beat so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I told her," he continued, standing and walking toward her, "that for the first time in my life, I'm learning what it means to truly love. Not with the blind madness of youth, but with the conscious decision to choose someone each day, to work for something worthwhile." He stood before her now, so close she could feel the heat emanating from him. "I chose you, Cordelia. I choose you." The tears she had held all night finally released. She didn't know who moved first, but suddenly she was in his arms, sobbing against his chest while he stroked her hair, and whispered words that sounded like promises and apologies and sacred vows. "I was so afraid," she confessed between tears. "Afraid you still loved her." "There's no room in me for anyone else," he responded. "You filled everything without me realizing." They separated enough to look at each other. Both their eyes shone with the same emotion, the same shared vulnerability. "I don't want us in separate rooms," she said, surprising herself with her own audacity. "Not anymore." "Are you sure?" "Not about everything, but about this, yes." That night, for the first time since their wedding, they slept in the same bed. There was no passion, not yet. Only the intimacy of two bodies finally allowing themselves closeness, the comfort of feeling another heart, beating beside their own in the darkness. It was a beginning, imperfect, but real. And as dawn painted the Boston sky pink, Cordelia knew they had weathered a storm and emerged, not intact but together. There was still road to travel, wounds to heal, trust to rebuild. But for the first time, she genuinely believed they would make it. The following months were an exercise in patient reconstruction. Like two architects working on ruins, Cordelia and Thaddeus learned to demolish the debris of the past while laying new foundations for the future. Mornings acquired a new routine. They woke together, though often he left early for business while she prepared for university. But now there were small rituals that made the difference. The coffee he personally prepared before leaving, the kiss on her forehead he gave while she still drowsed, the notes he left on the pillow for her to find upon waking. "You're the first thing I think of when I wake and the last before I sleep. T. Today you have the macroeconomics exam. I know you'll excel. Waiting for you at home with your favorite cake. 10 months. 10 months wasted. I don't intend to waste another day." Cordelia kept all the notes in a carved wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother. Sometimes, in moments of doubt that inevitably came, she reread them as evidence that the change was real, that the man who had written them was different from the one who had abandoned her on their wedding night. But the transformation wasn't only his. Cordelia was also changing, allowing herself to lower the defenses she had maintained raised for so long. She began to speak of her own fears, the terror of not being enough, the insecurity inherited from years of feeling invisible, the difficulty trusting that someone could love her without conditions. Nights became their favorite time. Curled on the library sofa, sharing a blanket while the fire crackled in the fireplace, they talked about everything and nothing. He told her about the years at boarding school in Switzerland, about the pressure of being the perfect heir, about the times he had wanted to flee and lose himself in some corner of the world. She spoke of her childhood in Napa Valley, of the smell of blooming vineyards, of the grandmother who taught her to read the stars. "I never asked you," he said one night, "what you wanted to be when you were little." Cordelia smiled, remembering. "I wanted to be an explorer. I had a world map in my room and marked with pins all the places I'd visit someday." "And how many pins did you manage to place?" "Only one, Boston. My mother said ladies don't travel alone." Thaddeus looked at her with an intensity that made her blush. "How about we add some more?" 2 weeks later, they were flying to Rome. It was the first of many trips they would make together in the following months. Romantic dinners before the Colosseum, gondola rides through Venice, sunrises in Santorini with the Aegean stretching infinite before them. Each destination was another pin on Cordelia's mental map, each shared experience another brick in the fortress of their relationship. But not everything was easy. Old wounds had the habit of reopening when least expected. One night in Paris, after a perfect dinner near the Seine, Thaddeus disappeared for hours without warning. Cordelia waited in the hotel room, panic growing with each passing minute, shadows of the past sliding insidiously. When he finally returned, he found his wife crying by the window. "Where were you?" she asked, hating the desperation in her voice. "I went to get this," he responded, showing a small velvet box. "I wanted to surprise you for our anniversary." Inside was a ring, different from the one he had given her at their wedding. This one was simple, a gold band with an inscription inside, "The beginning of us." "A year ago we married," he said, kneeling before her. "But today is when we really begin. Would you allow me to start over with you?" Cordelia looked at him through tears, seeing in his eyes the sincerity she had once believed impossible. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. When they returned to Boston, something had definitively changed. Separate rooms were a thing of the past. Now they shared not only the bed, but also dreams, fears, hopes. Mrs. Millicent observed her son's transformation with a mixture of astonishment and something that looked like approval. She even began treating Cordelia with genuine affection that went beyond obligatory courtesy. "You're good for him," she told her one afternoon while they had tea in the garden. "Better than I thought possible." It was as close to an apology as the elderly woman would ever offer, and Cordelia accepted it as the gift it was. The second anniversary found them different, stronger, more united, more real. They had learned that true love wasn't a destination, but a path, that it required constant work and conscious choice each day. They had stumbled, fallen, and risen together, and though challenges still remained to face, now they knew they could overcome them, because the love they had built wasn't the fairy tale romance she had dreamed of as a child. It was something better. It was real. It was tested. It was theirs. The spring of their second year of marriage brought news that would change everything. Cordelia had been feeling strange for weeks. Morning nausea, inexplicable fatigue, an emotional sensitivity that made her cry at television commercials. When she finally gathered the courage to take the test, the result left her staring at the small indicator for what seemed like hours. Positive. The joy that flooded her was immediate and intense, but quickly mixed with fear. Were they ready? Was their relationship strong enough to bear this monumental responsibility? She remembered her mother-in-law's words from that distant night, talking about heirs as if they were products to be manufactured. Would this baby be celebrated as the fulfillment of a business contract or as the fruit of true love? She decided to wait before telling Thaddeus, needing time to process her own feelings. But he knew her too well not to notice something had changed. He watched her with growing concern, noting the times she excused herself to go to the bathroom, the meals she barely touched, the distant gazes that lost themselves on the horizon. One night, while she idly flipped through a book she wasn't reading, he sat beside her and took her hand. "Tell me what's happening," he requested gently. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Cordelia looked at him, this man who had gone from being a stranger to becoming her everything. Fear remained present, but now it was accompanied by something stronger. certainty. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. Thaddeus's face passed through a kaleidoscope of emotions in a matter of seconds. Surprise, disbelief, and finally a joy so pure and overflowing it illuminated every corner of his being. "Really?" he asked, his voice breaking. "We're going to be parents?" She nodded, tears already rolling down her cheeks. He wrapped her in an embrace so intense she feared she'd stop breathing, but she didn't care. She could feel him trembling, hear the muffled sobs against her hair, feel his tears mixing with hers. "I'm afraid," she confessed when they finally separated, "afraid of not being a good mother, afraid our past will affect this baby." Thaddeus looked at her with a seriousness she had rarely seen. "Listen to me," he said, taking her face in his hands. "What we were before doesn't determine what we'll be. We've proven we can change, that we can grow. This baby will be born into a family where the parents consciously chose each other, where love isn't taken for granted, but cultivated each day. That's more than many children have." His words were the balm she needed. The following months were filled with preparations and shared dreams, decorating the nursery with star murals, discussing names until late into the night, feeling together the first kicks announcing a new life. But pregnancy also brought challenges. Cordelia had to reduce her study hours, and though her professors were understanding, it hurt to see her academic progress slow. There were moments of frustration, of feeling trapped between the desire to keep growing professionally and the responsibility of caring for the new life growing within her. Thaddeus, to her surprise, became her greatest support. He restructured his work schedules to be more present, accompanying her to medical appointments, massaging her swollen feet at day's end, listening when she needed to vent. "You'll finish your degree," he promised one night, while she cried in frustration after having to postpone an exam. "Even if I have to turn the office into a nursery so you can study while I care for the baby. We'll make it work." And she believed him because she had learned this man kept his promises. Labor came in the early hours of a June morning when fog covered Boston with a grey blanket transforming the city into a watercolor. It was hours of pain and uncertainty, with Thaddeus holding her hand without letting go for a second, whispering words of encouragement she could barely hear but somehow felt. And then, with a cry that resonated like celestial music, their daughter came into the world. They named her Hope, like Cordelia's maternal grandmother, but also as a symbol of everything she represented. The hope that had survived the months of darkness, the hope that had guided them toward the light. When Thaddeus held his daughter for the first time, Cordelia saw something she would never forget. The man who had once closed his heart to the world now openly wept, looking at the small creature in his arms as if she were the universe's greatest miracle. "Thank you," he whispered, looking at his wife, "for not giving up on me, for giving us this." And in that moment, surrounded by medical staff and beeping monitors and the orderly chaos of a hospital, Cordelia knew all the pain of the past had been worth it, because it had brought them here, to this perfect moment, to this imperfect but completely theirs family. The first months of motherhood were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, endless diapers, and happiness so intense it sometimes left her breathless. Hope was a baby with dark eyes like her mother's and jet-black hair like her father's, with a temperament oscillating between absolute calm and cries that shook the mansion walls. Cordelia discovered facets of herself she didn't know existed, the protective fierceness she felt for her daughter, the infinite patience she could deploy even after the 5th consecutive night without more than 2 hours of sleep, the capacity to love so deeply it sometimes hurt in her chest. But she also faced unexpected demons. There were days when she felt lost, disconnected from the woman she had been before pregnancy. She looked at her textbooks accumulating dust on the shelf and felt a pang of loss. She saw herself in the mirror, with marked dark circles and clothes stained with milk, and wondered where that Cordelia had gone who walked university corridors with newly discovered confidence. It was Thaddeus who noticed the signs before anyone. "When was the last time you did something just for you?" he asked one afternoon, finding her sitting on the sofa with a lost gaze while Hope slept. Cordelia looked at him without understanding. "Something for me. Read a book that isn't about child development," Go for a walk without the stroller. Have coffee with Constance. She realized then that she had forgotten how to care for herself. She had poured every gram of energy into her daughter and husband, forgetting she also needed nourishment for the soul. Thaddeus took charge. He hired a trusted nanny for afternoons, insisted she reconnect with her friends, and made sure she had time for herself. Saturday mornings became her sacred moment. While he cared for Hope, she resumed meetings at the Boston Public Library, feeding the intellectual part of her being that had been languishing. "I don't want you to lose who you are," he explained when she protested she could manage. "You fell in love with studying, with intellectual discussions, with growing as a person. That doesn't have to end because you're also a mother now." His words moved her profoundly. She remembered so many women in her social circle who had been completely absorbed by motherhood, losing any identity of their own beyond being so-and-so's mother. Thaddeus was offering her something different, the possibility of being all versions of herself simultaneously. When Hope turned 6 months old, Cordelia made an important decision. She spoke with her professors, designed a flexible study plan, and resumed classes. It wasn't easy. There were exams she had to take running on 3 hours of sleep, papers she wrote with one hand while rocking the baby with the other. But each academic achievement was a personal victory, an affirmation that she could be mother and independent woman at the same time. Barnaby, who had remained a close friend throughout, received her with open arms. "I knew you'd come back," he said with a proud smile. "You're too brilliant to stay home changing diapers all your life. Not that changing diapers isn't valuable," he added quickly, "but you have much more to offer the world." Constance became a constant presence, often bringing her own children to play with Hope, while the mothers studied together. What had begun as a casual friendship transformed into a deep sisterhood, forged in the shared crucible of motherhood and intellectual ambition. One day, while watching Hope take her first wobbly steps across the garden, clutching her father's fingers, Cordelia experienced a moment of absolute clarity. She had spent years building walls to protect herself, believing vulnerability was weakness. But now she saw the truth. It had been the willingness to open up, to risk, to trust again that had given her all this. A daughter who filled her with wonder each day, a husband who loved her not despite her complexities, but because of them, a life that, though imperfect, was immensely rich. "What are you thinking about?" Thaddeus asked, lifting Hope onto his shoulders while the child laughed delightedly. "About how much I almost lost by being afraid," she responded, "and how grateful I am to have been brave enough to try." He looked at her with those brown eyes that had once been so distant and that now saw her with a tenderness that still moved her. "We were brave together," he said. "That's the difference." He was right. Neither of them could have gotten here alone. It had been the combination of their strengths, their weaknesses, their shared and overcome fears that had forged this present. And as she observed her family bathed in the golden light of the Boston sunset, Cordelia knew she had learned the most important lesson of all. True love wasn't a passive feeling that arrived and stayed. It was an active choice, renewed each day to keep walking together no matter what obstacles the path placed in their way. Their third wedding anniversary brought a crisis that would test everything they had built. It didn't come with cinematic drama or explosive revelations. It arrived, like so many real crises, disguised as everyday life. Thaddeus had been working tirelessly for months. The coffee company faced major expansion into the Asian market, an opportunity that couldn't be missed, but demanded enormous sacrifices. Travel multiplied: Tokyo, Shanghai, Seoul. Nights at home became rare luxuries. Family dinners, once sacred, were now peppered with urgent phone calls and hurried apologies. Cordelia tried to be understanding. She understood the pressure he faced, the weight of family expectations, the responsibility to hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on the company's success. But understanding didn't eliminate the pain of absences, the loneliness of raising Hope practically alone for weeks at a time, the growing feeling they were becoming strangers again. One night, after he cancelled for the third consecutive time an anniversary dinner they had been planning for weeks, something broke inside her. "When will I be your priority?" she asked when he finally arrived home past midnight, exhausted and guilt-ridden. "Cordelia, you know this is temporary." You said the same thing 3 months ago. And 6. There's always a reason, always something more important. It's not that it's more important, he protested, loosening his tie with frustrated movements. It's that it's necessary, the company. To hell with the company. The intensity of her own voice surprised her, but she couldn't contain herself. What's the point of building an empire if you lose your family in the process? The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken words and accumulated resentments. Thaddeus looked at her with an expression mixing guilt, frustration, and something that looked like fear. I don't want to lose you, he said finally, his voice reduced to a whisper. I don't want to lose you both. Then prove it. With actions, not words. That night they slept in the same room but in different worlds, each on their side of the bed, the space between them wider than the oceans he crossed for business. The following days were tense. Cordelia took refuge in her studies and hope, while Thaddeus seemed more lost than ever, divided between work demands and fear of losing what he loved most. Mrs. Millicent, silent observer from her corner of the mansion, finally intervened in a way no one expected. Come with me, she told Thaddeus one morning, dragging him to the garden where late roses fought against autumn cold. Cordelia observed them from the window, seeing mother and son converse for almost an hour. She couldn't hear the words, but saw the exact moment something changed in Thaddeus's posture. Shoulders that relaxed, head that nodded slowly, hands that clenched into fists before releasing in surrender. That afternoon he came to pick her up at the university. He brought no flowers or gifts, only his presence and an expression of determination she knew well. I need to show you something, he said simply. He drove to the city outskirts, to a property she didn't know. It was a small estate compared to the mansion, a stone house surrounded by vineyards reminiscent of her native Napa Valley. Sunset painted everything gold as he guided her along the garden paths. I bought it months ago, he explained, as an anniversary gift, but also as a promise. A promise of what? He stopped before her, taking her hands in his. That things are going to change. I've reorganized everything, appointed a general director for international operations, delegated responsibilities I should have released years ago. My mother reminded me today of something I'd forgotten. What? That my father died working. Literally. A heart attack in his office at 53, surrounded by contracts and balance sheets, with no one to hold his hand. My mother lived the best years of her marriage alone, waiting for a man who never stopped chasing the next deal. Tears began sliding down Cordelia's cheeks as she understood the weight of that confession. I don't want that for us, Thaddeus continued, his own voice breaking. I don't want Hope to grow up thinking her father is a ghost who occasionally appears. I don't want you to feel alone in a marriage again. I don't want to wake up one day and realize I lost the only thing that truly matters. Thaddeus, this estate is for us, to escape when the city suffocates us, to raise our children with their feet on the ground, literally, to remember that success means nothing if there's no one to share it with. She looked at him, at this man who had traveled such a long road from the stranger who abandoned her on their wedding night. She saw the scars of the past, the internal battles he still fought, but also saw something more, a genuine love, imperfect but persistent, that refused to give up. I don't know if I can believe this time will be different, she admitted. Then I'll show you, every day, for the rest of my life if necessary. He kissed her under the darkening sky, surrounded by the aroma of vineyards and the song of crickets awakening for the night concert. And when they finally separated, she saw in his eyes the same promise she had seen that night in Paris, but more mature, more solid. Let's start again, she said, for the 3rd time. As many times as necessary, he responded, always. Their 4th wedding anniversary coincided with Cordelia's graduation day. It was a resplendent November morning, the kind of day that seemed specifically designed for celebrations and new beginnings. Harvard's auditorium was packed with proud families, professors in academic robes, and nervous students adjusting their caps. Cordelia was among them, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her ears. It wasn't just ceremony nerves, it was the magnitude of the moment, the closing of a circle that had begun in the darkest days of her marriage. In the front row, she spotted her small support army. Thaddeus held Hope, now a 3-year-old girl with unruly curls and her mother's determination. Beside them sat Mrs. Millicent, surprisingly present, and with an expression bordering on genuine pride. Constance and Barnaby occupied adjacent seats, their own children fidgeting restlessly but contained. When her turn came to receive the diploma, Cordelia climbed to the stage with steps that didn't tremble. The dean pronounced her full name, and she walked toward him while applause filled the auditorium. But in that moment, she only had eyes for the front row. Thaddeus had stood, holding Hope, who applauded with childish enthusiasm, his eyes bright with tears he didn't try to hide. It was the perfect image of everything she had gained, not just a diploma, but a family, a love tested by fire, a life she had built from the ashes of a disastrous beginning. The reception afterward was a mixture of congratulations, hugs, and freely flowing champagne. Barnaby gave an emotional toast, remembering the brilliant student who had entered his class years ago, seeking more than knowledge. "You were searching for purpose," he said, raising his glass, "and you found much more. You've proven that adversity doesn't define our destiny, our choices do." To Cordelia, living proof that it's never too late to reinvent yourself. Later, when guests dispersed and only immediate family remained, Thaddeus took her aside. He had that expression she had learned to recognize, nervous anticipation mixed with excitement. "I have something for you," he said, pulling an envelope from his jacket's inner pocket. Inside were airline tickets and an elaborate itinerary: Paris, Rome, Florence, Santorini, all the places where they had placed pins on their emotional map, and many new ones still waiting to be discovered. "An entire month," he explained. "My mother will care for Hope. It's her graduation gift," she said. Cordelia looked at her mother-in-law with surprise, finding a genuine smile on that face that had once been so cold. "You've earned it," Mrs. Millicent said simply. "You both have." But the real surprise came that night, when they returned to the vineyard estate that had become their favorite refuge. Thaddeus had organized an intimate dinner in the garden, candles floating in small water bowls, the aroma of jasmine mixing with the night breeze, soft music that seemed to emanate from the air itself. After dinner, while they danced slowly under the stars, he stopped and looked at her with a seriousness that put her on alert. "There's something I need to ask you," he said. "Something I should have asked 4 years ago, but didn't know how." He knelt before her, and Cordelia felt her heart stop. "I don't have a new ring," he continued, "because the one you wear means everything we've overcome together. But I need to ask you, Cordelia Winthrop Ashford Pemberton, would you do me the honor of choosing me again? Not because our families decided it, not because it's convenient or practical, simply because you love me as much as I love you." Tears fell freely down her cheeks as she looked at this man who had gone from being her greatest disappointment to becoming her greatest blessing. "Yes," she responded, her voice broken but firm. "I choose you. I chose you long ago, I just didn't know it." They kissed under the starry Massachusetts sky, surrounded by the whisper of vines and the promise of a future that finally belonged to them. It wasn't the fairy tale kiss she had imagined as a child, it was something better. It was the kiss of 2 survivors who had found their way back to each other, who had transformed pain into strength and abandonment into belonging. When they finally separated, she rested her head on his chest, listening to the constant beating of his heart. "Do you remember our wedding night?" she asked softly. "Every painful second," he responded with regret. "It's the night I regret most in my life." "I remember it too. But now I understand something I couldn't see then." "What?" "That night wasn't the end of our story. It was just the prologue. The real story began after, when we decided we deserved something better, when we stopped being victims of our circumstances and became authors of our own destiny." Thaddeus held her tighter, kissing the top of her head. "You're the most extraordinary woman I've ever met," he murmured, "and every day I'm more amazed you chose to stay." "It wasn't just choice," she responded. "It was faith. Faith that people can change. Faith that love can grow where it didn't exist. Faith in us." Dawn found them still together, intertwined in the porch hammock, watching the sun paint the sky pink and gold. It was a new day, one of many they would share. And though they knew there would be future challenges, storms to weather, moments of doubt and frustration, they also knew something more important. They had proven they could overcome anything together. The circle had completed. The abandoned bride had conquered the impossible, not a man, but herself. She had found her worth, her voice, her power, and in the process, she had helped another broken human being heal alongside her. That, she thought as the sun warmed her face, was the true happy ending. 10 years later, the Beacon Hill Mansion's garden was unrecognizable. Where formal roses and precisely trimmed hedges once stood, now bloomed a controlled chaos of lavender, rosemary and thyme, aromatic Mediterranean plants that perfumed the air with memories of distant lands. A wooden swing hung from the old oak, and children's laughter mixed with birdsong. Cordelia observed the scene from the porch, a coffee cup warming her hands while afternoon sun bathed everything in liquid gold. Hope, now a 13-year-old girl with her mother's intelligence and her father's determination, was teaching her younger brother Matthew to climb the tree. The 5-year-old looked at her with absolute adoration, trying to imitate each movement with childhood's charming clumsiness. "You're going to give me a heart attack watching them climb," Thaddeus said, appearing beside her with his own coffee cup. "Children need to take some risks," she responded with a smile. "It's how we learn to be brave." He wrapped an arm around her, drawing her to his side in that gesture so familiar after a decade together. "Speaking of bravery, nervous about tomorrow?" Tomorrow, the day Cordelia Pemberton, formerly Winthrop Ashford, would officially assume as CEO of the merged family corporation. What had begun as 2 crisis companies joining for survival had transformed, under her strategic leadership, into an agribusiness empire exporting wine and coffee to more than 40 countries. "A little," she admitted, "but more excited than nervous. You're going to be extraordinary, as in everything you do." She looked at him, at this man who had aged beside her, whose temples now showed silver threads and whose expression lines told the story of shared laughter and overcome worries. The love she felt for him was different from what she had tried to feel in the early days of their marriage. It wasn't youth's romantic fantasy. It was something deeper, more robust, forged in the reality of good and bad days, of disagreements and reconciliations, of growing together instead of apart. "Do you remember when you told me things couldn't be fixed with flowers?" he asked. "I remember everything from those days, though sometimes they seem to belong to another life." "In a way they do. We were different people then." It was true. The Cordelia of 10 years ago, the abandoned bride who cried alone in a hotel suite, had transformed into someone she would barely recognize, not because pain had hardened her, but because it had refined her, like fire refines gold. She had learned to convert each obstacle into a stepping stone, each wound into wisdom. And Thaddeus, the man who had fled his wedding night terrified of feeling, now was a devoted father who didn't miss a school play or a children's soccer game. He had learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that loving deeply was the bravest act a human being could perform. The garden gate opened and Mrs. Millicent appeared, leaning on a cane but with the same regal bearing as always. At 80, the elderly woman had considerably softened her sharpest edges, especially since grandchildren had entered her life. "Dinner is ready," she announced. "And those children better come down from that tree before I have a fit." Hope descended agilely, helping Matthew with a patience that moved Cordelia. Seeing them together, so different but so united, was a constant reminder that family wasn't just blood. It was choice, commitment, love converted into daily action. Dinner passed among stories of the day, plans for summer at the Vineyard Estate, and Matthew's endless questions about why the sky was blue and clouds white. The table that had once been a scene of tense silences and evasive glances now overflowed with laughter and genuine connection. Later, when children were in their rooms and Mrs. Millicent had retired to rest, Cordelia and Thaddeus sat in their favorite spot, the stone bench by the garden fountain. Stars began appearing one by one, like luminous promises in the sky's velvet. "Do you regret anything?" she asked, an echo of past conversations that now carried different weight. Thaddeus considered seriously before responding. I regret the months we lost at the beginning, the pain I caused you, but I can't regret the path that brought us here, because every step, even the wrong ones, was necessary to turn us into who we are now. Sometimes I think about the woman I was 10 years ago, she confessed. So frightened, so broken. I wish I could tell her everything will be all right. Perhaps that's what we do when we tell our story, he suggested. We tell it to all the past versions of ourselves, and to everyone who needs to hear that pain isn't permanent. She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the solidity of his presence, the certainty of his love. You know what I've learned in all these years? Tell me. That true love isn't finding someone perfect. It's finding someone imperfect and choosing to build something beautiful together day after day. It's forgiving when it hurts, persisting when it's difficult, and never stopping choosing each other. Thaddeus took her hand, intertwining their fingers as they had done thousands of times, and not giving up, he added, even when everything seems lost. Especially then. Especially then, she repeated. They remained in silence, looking at the stars their ancestors had also contemplated, that their children would someday look at with their own loves. The cycle continued, imperfect and beautiful, painful and hopeful. Cordelia thought about everything she had gained, a career that filled her with purpose, children who amazed her each day, a marriage that had survived the impossible. But more than anything, she had gained herself. She had discovered she was strong, capable, worthy of love and respect, and that, perhaps, was the greatest triumph of all. I love you, she said, because some things deserve to be said aloud again and again. I love you, he responded, always. The full moon rose over Boston, bathing the garden in silver and promises. Somewhere in the house, Hope practiced piano and Matthew dreamed of adventures. Life continued its eternal dance of endings and beginnings, of losses and encounters. And in the midst of it all, two people who had once been strangers, who had once been broken in different but complementary ways, held each other in the darkness, exactly as they had learned to do. Not because it was easy, but because they had chosen each other. And they would continue choosing each other each day for the rest of their lives. Because sometimes true love doesn't begin with a kiss under moonlight. Sometimes it begins with the sound of a door closing and the decision made in the deepest darkness not to give up, to believe that dawn will come, and to be there together when it finally does.